Martin and Dean Holloway weren't born into crime. They built it, brick by brick, until a scrapyard hustle turned into a 17 million property empire that fooled banks, police, and half of Birmingham. What began as two brothers stripping metal for cash would evolve into one of Britain's most sophisticated money laundering schemes. An empire that grew in plain sight, thrived on fear, and vanished overnight, leaving only empty offices, missing millions, and a mystery no one has ever solved. In the early 2000s, the industrial edges of Birmingham were a maze of smoke, rust, and forgotten factories. The clanging of metal and the smell of oil filled the air, and among the noise worked the Holloway brothers, Martin and Dean. They weren't remarkable men to look at. They wore the same oil-stained overalls as everyone else, drove old vans, and kept to themselves. Their scrapyard, a fenced patch of land littered with car shells and twisted steel, looked no different from any other. But beneath the surface, it was more than a business. It was the beginning of a criminal empire. The brothers started small. They bought wrecked cars from auctions, stripped them for parts, and sold the metal to overseas buyers. It was honest enough work, but Martin had a sharp mind for money, and Dean had a mean streak that kept trouble away. When the market dipped, they began cutting corners, buying stolen car parts, fiddling with weights on the scales, and quietly underpaying sellers. Soon they realized they could use the scrapyard for something bigger, moving cash that didn't come from scrap at all. At first it was simple. A local gang dealing in counterfeit cigarettes needed to wash a few £1,000s. The Holloways ran it through their books as a metal sale. The profit looked clean, and everyone got paid. Word spread quickly through Birmingham's underworld. The Holloway brothers could make dirty money disappear. By the end of that year, the small scrapyard that once struggled to stay open was suddenly thriving. Trucks rolled in and out every day, some carrying real metal, others carrying secret. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. Rival scrap dealers began to ask questions. A few even tried to copy their methods. One in particular, a man named Alan Ridge, started undercutting their prices and taking their clients. Within weeks, rumors began circulating that Ridge had been threatening the Holloways for a share of their business. Then one night in late November, his car was found burned out on a deserted road. The police called it an accident. Those who knew him whispered that it wasn't. After that, no one challenged the Holloways again. The scrapyard became more than a workplace. It was a fortress. Dean managed the muscle, hiring local thugs to keep watch and make deliveries. Martin stayed in the office, building contacts with buyers, brokers, and anyone willing to look the other way. Every month, more money passed through their hands, and every month their confidence grew. They started buying expensive watches, cars, and small plots of land under other people's names. To outsiders, they were successful businessmen who had worked their way up from nothing. To those inside the criminal network, they were indispensable. But power came with paranoia. They installed cameras around the yard, changed phone numbers weekly, and used code words for everything. Their employees were paid in cash and told never to ask questions. The brothers knew their business was a ticking bomb, but they also knew they'd found a system too profitable to stop. By the time investigators began noticing the sudden rise in their income, the Holloways had already moved beyond scrap. They had discovered something far more lucrative than metal: the art of turning crime into respectability. The Holloway brothers' scrapyard had become a steady machine for washing dirty money, but by 2006, they faced a growing problem. Cash. Bundles of notes were piling up faster than they could spend or hide. Keeping it in safes and garages was dangerous, and the banks were asking too many questions. They needed something that could swallow huge amounts of money and make it look legitimate. That's when Martin noticed an opportunity in the city's crumbling streets. Across Birmingham, rows of old houses stood empty, boarded up and forgotten. Prices were low, and the property market was just beginning to rise. He saw a way to turn their illegal profits into bricks, mortar, and respectability. The first purchase was small, a derelict two-bedroom terrace in Handsworth. They paid cash through a middleman who registered the property under a fake name, A month later, they renovated it, which really meant painting the walls and replacing a few windows. Then they sold it to an overseas buyer at twice the price. The money went straight into their company account, and for the first time, it looked completely clean. They had found the perfect laundering tool. Soon, they were buying multiple properties every month. Some were sold off quickly, others were kept and rented to tenants. Every transaction created paperwork, receipts, and tax filings that looked legitimate on the surface. The brothers even hired a local accountant, someone who didn't ask too many questions, but knew exactly what to file to keep the authorities away. The more they expanded, the less anyone questioned where the money came from. Property was a businessman's game, and no one suspected that two scrapyard dealers could be hiding a criminal network beneath it. As their confidence grew, so did their ambitions. They began setting up limited companies with fake directors and offshore accounts. Each company owned just one or two properties, making it nearly impossible to link everything together. Money from drug trafficking, counterfeit goods, and protection rackets was quietly funneled into these shell firms. On paper, the Holloways looked like investors who had struck gold in a booming housing market. In reality, they were recycling crime into capital. To attract attention away from their past, Martin began showing up at local property auctions, dressed in tailored suits. Dean handled the rougher side, collecting rent, evicting problem tenants, and ensuring no one dug too deep. They were cautious but clever, always keeping their names off the official paperwork. Everything was paid through intermediaries, or cash couriers who took their cut and disappeared. Even when a few reporters started writing about the sudden rise of mystery buyers in rundown areas, no one ever traced the deals back to them. Within a few years, their investments stretched far beyond Birmingham. They bought small apartment blocks in Manchester, student houses in Nottingham, and even a few seaside rentals under new shell companies. Each one was another layer of protection, another disguise for the fortune they were quietly building. The scrap business still operated, but it had become just a front, a cover story for the empire taking shape behind the scenes. The brothers no longer spent their days among broken cars and oil drums. Instead, they spent them touring half-finished buildings, signing documents, and counting profits. Property wasn't just a business to them anymore. It was a shield, a way to rewrite who they were, and as the numbers grew, they started to believe they had outsmarted everyone. What they didn't realize was that every transaction, every fake renovation, and every offshore payment left a trail, a paper trail that would one day come back to destroy them. As the Holloway brothers' property empire grew, so did the number of people who wanted a piece of it. At first, they had managed to stay quiet, operating in the shadows while the money flowed in. But success has a way of attracting attention, and before long, other figures from Birmingham's underworld began to take notice. Some wanted to invest, others simply wanted in. The brothers realized that to protect what they had built, they needed allies, powerful ones. That was how they began working with their so-called silent partners. It started with small-time drug dealers, who needed to launder a few £1,000s. The brothers would buy a house using that money, renovate it just enough to look respectable, then sell or rent it out under one of their shell companies. The dealers got clean profits back, and the Holloways took their share. It was simple, efficient, and soon became an open secret among criminals. Before long, bigger players began to call. Leaders of local gangs saw the Holloways as more than businessmen. They were bankers who could turn cash into assets. Martin handled these partnerships carefully. He met only through intermediaries and used coded paperwork. Dean, on the other hand, preferred direct control. He made sure their partners knew who was in charge. Anyone who threatened to expose them was dealt with swiftly. Rumors spread about men who had crossed the brothers and later disappeared or suddenly left town. Fear worked better than any contract. Within a few years, the Holloways weren't just running their own operation, they were managing the financial backbone of organized crime across the Midlands. They expanded their circle to include accountants who could cook numbers, estate agents who would push through questionable sales, lawyers who knew how to make problems vanish from public record. One solicitor in particular, known for representing high-profile developers, became their key asset. He helped them create a network of offshore companies registered in places where financial transparency barely existed. These entities allowed the Holloways to buy and sell properties across the UK without ever appearing on paper themselves. The money poured in from every direction. Drug syndicates, car theft rings, and even smuggling operations funneled their earnings through the brothers' property deals. The system worked like clockwork. Cash came in, assets were purchased, renovations were staged, and profits were sent out as dividends from legitimate businesses. Every transaction looked clean. Every property looked genuine. The illusion was flawless. But as the empire expanded, cracks began to form. The brothers' new partners weren't all loyal. Some grew greedy, demanding a larger cut or threatening to expose the setup if they didn't get their way. The Holloways responded with intimidation, paying off some and scaring others into silence. They were no longer scrapyard men. They were mob financiers, untouchable and feared. Yet the more people they pulled into this operation, the harder it became to control the flow of secrets. By 2012, the Holloways' network stretched across multiple cities and dozens of criminal groups. No single person could track the full picture, and that was exactly how they wanted it. The brothers believed they had built something unstoppable, a fortress of money, hidden behind layers of respectability. But beneath the surface, too many hands were dipping into their pot. Too many eyes watching for an opportunity. The same web that had protected them was slowly becoming a trap. And while Martin and Dean celebrated their rise as property tycoons, the foundation of their empire had already begun to rot from within. By the time 2015 arrived, the Holloway brothers were no longer just names whispered in the backrooms of Birmingham pubs. They were seen as legitimate businessmen, successful property developers, who had risen from nothing. Their faces appeared in local newspapers, shaking hands with counselors at charity fundraisers and cutting ribbons at housing projects. To the public, they were the picture of ambition and redemption. No one suspected that the gleaming towers and renovated flats behind their empire had been built on criminal money. The transformation was staggering. Over a decade, the Holloways had quietly assembled a property portfolio worth over £17 million. Their holdings included student housing near universities, luxury apartments in the city center, entire rows of renovated terraces in working-class areas, and even commercial warehouses along the outskirts. Each property had been purchased through a maze of shell companies, making it nearly impossible to trace ownership. The paperwork was immaculate, the taxes paid and the rent collected on time. On the surface, everything appeared legitimate. Inside, however, the empire was a fragile illusion. Many of the properties were renovated with cheap materials and falsified safety certificates. Contractors were often paid in cash, cutting corners to save money. Some buildings had faulty wiring, unstable staircases, and plumbing that barely worked. Tenants complained, but their concerns were brushed aside. When inspectors visited, they were either bribed or distracted with forged reports. The Holloways didn't care about quality, they cared about appearances. As long as the rent kept flowing, the cracks could stay hidden. The brothers' lifestyles reflected their newfound wealth. Martin moved into a mansion on the outskirts of Solihull, complete with marble floors and a private cinema. Dean bought a fleet of luxury cars, each registered under different company names. They hosted lavish parties, filled with politicians, business owners and local celebrities who praised their success story. It was a performance, carefully crafted to hide the rot beneath the surface. Every smile, every handshake, and every donation was part of the act. Yet, despite the luxury, neither brother felt truly safe. They knew their wealth was built on lies, and that one wrong move could bring it all crashing down. They kept their circle small and trusted no one. Employees signed strict confidentiality agreements, and anyone who asked too many questions was swiftly dismissed. Their paranoia deepened when a journalist began investigating suspicious property purchases in the Midlands. Martin paid him off with a fake exclusive and a hefty sum, but the encounter left him uneasy. For the first time, he realized how easily their perfect image could be shattered. By 2016, the Holloways' reach extended far beyond the Midlands. They had investments in London developments, holiday rentals in Spain, and offshore holdings in Cyprus. Each venture brought in more money, but it also meant more people to manage and more lies to maintain. Dean enjoyed the power, while Martin grew increasingly cautious, aware that the higher they climbed, the harder they would fall. Still, neither could stop. The empire had taken on a life of its own, too big to control, too profitable to abandon. Behind the scenes, inspectors, auditors, and tax officers had started to notice patterns that didn't make sense. Properties changing hands too quickly, inflated valuations, and companies that appeared and vanished within months. But the Holloways were always one step ahead, moving money faster than anyone could trace it. They believed they were untouchable. What they didn't see was that every fraudulent report, every shell company, and every cash deal was slowly building a case against them. Their empire might have looked unbreakable, but its foundations were already cracking. The same system that had made them rich was quietly preparing to expose them, and when it did, the fall would be as spectacular as their rise. The beginning of the end came from a place the Holloway brothers never expected, inside their own network. For years, their web of fake companies, offshore accounts, and forged documents had kept the truth hidden. Every accountant, lawyer, and estate agent they worked with knew just enough to do their job, but never enough to see the full picture. That careful control was what kept them safe. Then one ordinary Monday morning, a small mistake changed everything. A junior accountant named Rachel Mullen had recently joined a firm that handled several of the Holloways' property companies. She was new, quiet, and eager to impress her bosses. While reviewing rental statements, she noticed something odd. A handful of properties that had no registered tenants were somehow generating large, consistent income. Curious, she double-checked the record. The supposed tenants didn't exist, and the bank transfers came from unrelated overseas accounts. When she raised the issue with her manager, he brushed it off, saying the clients were complicated investors and advising her to focus on other tasks. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A week later, she submitted an anonymous report to HMRC, flagging potential fraud in the account. It didn't take long for the report to reach the right hands. Within months, investigators from the National Crime Agency began quietly examining the Holloways' companies. They moved slowly, piecing together financial records, cross-checking ownership documents, and following paper trails that led to banks in Cyprus, Dubai, and Gibraltar. On the surface, everything looked legitimate, but underneath, the inconsistencies began to add up. Payments circled back to the same offshore accounts. Renovation costs were exaggerated. Properties were being sold at inflated prices to shell companies controlled by the brothers themselves. When the Holloways caught wind that something might be wrong, they panicked. Martin, the cautious one, wanted to tighten operations, delay new purchases, and move sensitive files offshore. Dean dismissed the warnings, insisting it was nothing more than routine tax scrutiny. To calm themselves, they even threw a small party to celebrate what they called 10 years of success. Behind the laughter, both brothers knew the storm was coming. As the investigation deepened, authorities began questioning their associates. A few of the brothers' partners, builders, solicitors, and estate agents were quietly approached by investigators. Some denied everything, but others started talking, hoping to save themselves. One builder admitted to falsifying invoices for renovations that never took place. Another confessed to paying kickbacks to Dean in cash. Piece by piece, the image of a legitimate business began to crumble. In desperation, the brothers tried to cover their tracks. They destroyed files, moved money through new accounts, and even offered consulting fees to an official they believed could make the investigation disappear. The bribe never reached its target. It was intercepted, documented, and added to the growing pile of evidence against them. By late 2017, the Holloways were under full surveillance. Their phones were tapped, their emails monitored, and their associates watched. Investigators were preparing a case that would expose one of the largest money laundering schemes ever tied to organized crime in the Midlands. But before the authorities could make their move, the brothers made one of their own. In the dead of winter, with their empire about to collapse, Martin and Dean Holloway disappeared. Their offices were emptied overnight, computers wiped, and millions of pounds in assets vanished into thin air. The empire they had built so carefully was finally cracking apart, and the men behind it were gone. The morning the Holloway brothers vanished, Birmingham woke up to silence. Their offices, once bustling with contractors, phone calls and endless paperwork, were empty. Desks were cleared, filing cabinets stood open, and computers had been wiped clean. The company cars were gone, the security guards dismissed, and the doors locked with new chains. It was as if the entire operation had evaporated overnight. When police arrived to serve search warrants, they found nothing but dust and a faint smell of bleach. Every document, every record, every trace of evidence had been erased. The last confirmed sighting of Martin and Dean came from CCTV footage captured at a private airfield outside Coventry. The footage showed them arriving in a black Range Rover late in the evening, carrying briefcases and duffel bags. They spoke briefly to a pilot, then disappeared into the darkness. Investigators later discovered that no flight had been recorded that night, no plane officially departed, and no passenger logs existed. It was as though the brothers had simply stepped off the map. Rumors began to spread, almost immediately. Some said they had fled to Spain's Costa del Sol, a popular refuge for British fugitives. Others believed they had escaped to Eastern Europe, where they had contacts and hidden properties. There were whispers that they'd been betrayed by one of their criminal partners and killed before they could flee, but without bodies, there was no proof. Only speculation. A week later, Dean's Range Rover was found abandoned near Dover, parked neatly by the roadside, with the keys still in the ignition. The glove compartment contained only an old map of France and a single parking ticket from a London address tied to one of their shell companies. The discovery of the vehicle triggered panic among their associates. Without the brothers, their carefully balanced network began to collapse. Tenants stopped paying rent, contractors demanded overdue wages, and offshore accounts froze without the Holloways' authorization. Some of their silent partners tried to reclaim their money. Others vanished just as quickly, fearing that the police were closing in. What had once been a smooth, powerful empire began to crumble into chaos. Behind the scenes, investigators were torn between triumph and frustration. They had spent years building a case against the Holloways, and now the prime suspects were gone. What they left behind was a maze of shell companies with fake directors, missing records, and untraceable funds. Bank accounts were drained in the final days before the brothers disappeared, suggesting they had prepared for this moment long in advance. The operation had been too precise, too well-timed to be spontaneous. Forensic teams searched the brothers' properties, hoping for clues. Martin's mansion was stripped bare. No clothes, no photos, no personal items. Dean's apartment was much the same, except for a single half-empty whiskey bottle and an ashtray filled with cigarette butts. It looked as though they had simply stood up and walked away from their lives. Months passed, and the story faded from headlines. Occasionally there were sightings. Someone claimed to have seen Martin in a Marbella nightclub. Another insisted Dean was living quietly in Prague under a new identity. None of these reports were ever confirmed. The brothers had become ghosts, legends whispered about in the criminal world. For the police, it was an unsolved mystery that haunted them for years. They had the evidence, the witness, and the proof of the crime. But without the Holloways, there could be no trial. All that remained were empty properties, seized assets, and questions that no one could answer. The empire had fallen, but its architects had disappeared into thin air. When the Holloway brothers vanished, investigators moved swiftly to seize everything they could find. The National Crime Agency froze dozens of bank accounts and began the process of confiscating properties linked to the brothers' companies. In total, more than 60 buildings across Birmingham, Manchester, and Nottingham were placed under investigation. But as the authorities dug deeper, they discovered something both puzzling and unsettling. The empire was still running. Rent payments continued to appear in the same accounts each month. Maintenance requests were being processed, and new tenants were signing leases. It was as if the brothers had never left. The investigation revealed that many of the properties were managed through offshore firms registered in countries where financial transparency was minimal. These companies had directors with fake names and false addresses, but their operations continued smoothly. Rent collected from tenants was automatically transferred through layers of foreign accounts, eventually landing in places beyond the reach of British authorities. The investigators realized they weren't dealing with a simple criminal operation. The Holloways had built a self-sustaining network, a machine designed to run without them. When forensic accountants traced the money flow, they found that over £5 million remained unaccounted for. Some of it had likely been moved overseas before the brothers disappeared, but a large portion seemed to be circulating within the system itself. Property managers and accountants continued working under standing instructions, unaware that their employers had vanished. The network was so complex that even the people maintaining it didn't understand who they were really working for. Rumors began to surface that loyal associates were still managing parts of the empire in secret. Former contractors spoke of late-night meetings and mysterious payments to keep properties running. Some claimed that Dean and Martin were still alive and communicating through intermediaries, ensuring the money kept flowing into hidden accounts. Others believed the brothers had handed control to a new generation of criminals who used their infrastructure as a blueprint for their own laundering operations. No one could prove any of it, but the evidence suggested that someone, somewhere, was still collecting the rent. Years passed, and the seized properties were slowly sold off, but not all of them. Legal battles over ownership dragged on endlessly because of the maze of shell companies and offshore trusts. Each time investigators thought they had reached the end of a trail, another company appeared, registered under a different name in a different country. It became nearly impossible to untangle. One financial expert described the case as a spider's web, with no center. Even when several properties were auctioned, the proceeds often vanished before the authorities could freeze them. The Holloway case turned into a legend among law enforcement. Training sessions used it as an example of how modern money laundering could hide in plain sight. Newspapers occasionally revisited the story, calling it Britain's invisible empire. But beyond the headlines and speculation, the most haunting detail remained. The system had never stopped working. The accounts continued to tick over, the building still generated profit, and rent payments kept arriving from tenants who had no idea their landlords were ghosts. Some investigators came to believe that the brothers had anticipated everything: the raids, the seizures, even their own disappearance. The empire they left behind wasn't an accident. It was a legacy, designed to outlive them, and in that sense, it had succeeded. The Holloways might have vanished, but their fortune, their influence, and their network endured. Hidden behind corporate paperwork and digital shadows, the empire was still alive and no one could kill it. Years after the Holloway brothers vanished, their story became part of Birmingham's dark folklore. People whispered about them in pubs and construction sites, speaking their names with a mix of awe and fear. The empire they had built refused to die. Many of the properties they once owned still stood, their walls hiding the truth of how they were paid for. Families lived in those houses, students rented those flats, and small businesses operated out of their warehouses. Most tenants had no idea that their monthly rent was once part of a criminal fortune. The money flowed quietly through the same channels the brothers had built, looping through offshore accounts that no one could trace. Even after years of investigation, authorities couldn't shut it all down. The system was too intricate, too carefully designed. For the police, the Holloway case became a symbol of unfinished business. Files filled with evidence sat locked in cabinets, marked pending. Detectives who had worked the case moved on, some retiring, others leaving the force altogether, but the mystery never faded. Every few years, new officers were assigned to review the material, hoping to find something everyone else had missed. They never did. The money trail was cold, The witnesses gone, and the key figures, Martin and Dean, were still nowhere to be found. Occasionally, fresh rumors reignited public interest. A photograph would surface of a man in Spain who looked like Martin, or someone would swear they had seen Dean in a bar in Cyprus. Each lead sent investigators scrambling, only for it to end in disappointment. Yet despite the lack of proof, few believed the brothers were dead. They had been too careful, too deliberate. Their disappearance felt planned, not desperate. Some speculated they had used false passports and started new lives under different names, blending in among expatriates on the Mediterranean coast. Others thought they were still pulling strings from the shadows, directing loyal associates through coded messages. Meanwhile, the empire they left behind continued to evolve. Former employees and criminal partners had learned from the Holloway's methods, creating new companies, buying new properties, and repeating the same laundering schemes. The brothers' playbook had become a manual for a new generation of white-collar criminals. It was no longer about drugs or violence. It was about paperwork, offshore trusts, and digital transfers. The line between legitimate business and organized crime grew thinner with every passing year. Local communities still felt the echoes of their empire. Some of the old properties fell into decay, owned by companies that no one could contact. Others flourished under new management, unknowingly funded by money that had once been stained with crime. The Holloway name was gone from the public record, but its shadow lingered over the city's skyline. Even now, investigators admit that millions of pounds remain missing, circulating somewhere in the global financial system. The brothers' story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily greed could disguise itself as success. They had risen from a scrapyard to a fortune worth £17 million, manipulating laws and people with chilling precision. In the end, their empire was not destroyed. It simply changed form. Somewhere, in the quiet corners of a foreign city, two men might still be watching their creation from afar. Perhaps they live under new names, walking along sunlit streets where no one knows who they are. Perhaps they still receive quiet transfers, their wealth hidden in plain sight. The police never found their bodies, their accounts, or their truth. And so the Holloway brothers became what all great criminals dream of becoming, not just rich, but untouchable. Their empire endures, not in the scrapyard where it began, but in the unseen flows of money that still move through Britain's streets. The Holloways may be gone, but their legend and their fortune live on.